So at the moment there's very little wiggle room in the budget, and I think part of that is because we don't do ground up budgeting. So we've just committed that this is roughly what operational expenditure is going to be.
Please explain to us what is ground up budgeting.
Well, ground up budgeting is basically saying, at the start of every budget period, but we don't really have a very clear start of a budget period. We theoretically run 3-year medium-term expenditure plans, but those are just constantly rolling. So it's not like we close off now and we open another 3 or 6 or whatever year budget period. So it's a constantly running budget period. Ideally, what we should be doing is we should say, okay, we're going to have 6-year development plans, for example, and we're going to do 3-year budgets, so 2 3-year budgets within those development plans. And in that period, we try to align expenditure with the development priorities in those development plans. With that, we should try and start from as close to zero expenditure as possible and say, okay, these are our priorities. How do we allocate the revenue that we have or that we expect to have over this period to those priorities? At the moment, though, we start with like 90 plus or 90 odd % kind of committed to already. So it means that you've at best got that sort of 10% to play with, and actually in reality we don't really even have that. So we don't really have much space to do anything. Whereas if we can say, okay, well, let's keep recurrent expenditure to 30 or 40% that we can't sort of do away with. This would be basic wages and so on. If we can keep it to 30 or 40%, and then we can have 60, 70% from the ground up, where we try and align that to what our development priorities are, then you can see a much closer alignment between development objectives and budgeting. And that's kind of going to be critical if we ever want to get on top of some of the socioeconomic problems that we sit with. So I think that's very fundamental. Because we don't have that much wiggle room. The key thing that I think this speaks to is that we need to make a material change to how we budget, but we also need to make a material change to the sort of non-government part of the economy to get growth back. We haven't seen any material growth in Namibia now for 6 or 7 years. This is really, really weird and abnormal for an economy. This is not a normal situation that we sit with. And you'll hear that there was, green shoots developing pre-COVID and so on, treated with a pinch of salt. I mean, there were some very small specks of light, but we hadn't resolved material problems. So we need to get growth back. Our government has one of the highest tax revenue to GDP ratios in the world. So we're somewhere between 3rd and 7th usually, which means that we actually have a very well-resourced government. And it's getting a big portion of what's available in the local economy out in order to utilize for public services, for redistributive purposes, etc., etc. So our government is not a government that's very short of resources. It more sits with an expenditure problem in terms of allocating those resources to these critical development objectives, these critical development targets that we sit with. So that's really where the problem lies. And so for government to take more out of the existing economy is not going to be that easy. There are 2 potential ways that it can be done. One is to improve tax compliance, so that's obviously very desirable. We don't want to have people who are avoiding paying tax, not paying their fair share, etc., etc. But I think some of the tax reluctance that we see from people who do avoid that is linked to the fact that they don't like the expenditure priorities. It's not really an acceptable justification, but I think that's one of the reasons. The other is just that people don't like paying tax. So that's one of the ways, is to improve compliance. I think that's very desirable. The other way is to look at how do we increase taxes. You asked earlier about personal income tax. I don't think that increases in personal income tax are likely. In fact, if anything, we should be increasing the minimum threshold from 50,000, which was set in 2013. So that's nearly a decade ago, and obviously what you could buy with 50,000 then and what you can buy with 50,000 now is quite different. So that we actually should be increasing. But I think the focus is more going to be on the business side of things. And in my mind, this is incredibly counterproductive at the moment. We need those job creators I mentioned earlier. We need businesses to want to invest here. And I'm not talking about briefcases of US dollars from the US or something like that, or foreign investors. I'm talking about local people who can start businesses as well. And I think that we need to make it a bit easier for those businesses, especially now with so many people losing jobs and there being so few jobs available. We need to make it easier for people to make livings for themselves and their communities and their friends and so on. And adding more taxes to what's already a very, very regressive, one-dimensional corporate tax system, I don't think will be beneficial. The idea behind this is that, Jonathan's welding down the road, where he started his business to, after losing a job in the tourism industry, to ask 32% of that plus another 8% or 10% dividend tax plus, that's really counterproductive to an economy like this. It's not that big a deal for an O&L, for a F&B or whatever, but because we have such a one-dimensional system, adding more taxes across the board is not going to be helpful in the current situation that we sit with. So we need to relook at that tax system and try to make it easier for small businesses to get established, to not have the big cash flow pressures associated with paying tax from day one, dividend taxes, corporate taxes, blah, 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 VAT from day one. We need to try to make it easier for people to help themselves in this environment and get the economy started again. And I think that more corporate taxes, if they're not very strategically applied, is going to be very counterproductive.